Good evening and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Lance Worrell and your MC for this event. I'm also Director for Industrial Transformation in the National newly launched Innovative Manufacturing Cooperative Research Centre. In that role, I operate from Flinders University and the Australian Industrial Transformation Institute at the Tonsley Park campus. On behalf of Flinders University, I acknowledge that the land upon which we meet today is part of the traditional lands of the Kaurna people and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Australian region and that their cultural heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. Now, it really is a pleasure to be able to welcome you all here tonight as participants in the Flinders University 2017 Investigator Lecture to be presented by Dr Tia Kansara as part of the Open State series of events. Today in South Australia, certain questions are particularly urgent. Questions like, what are innovation and entrepreneurship really? Are these things that only the brave loners can do in a supposedly free market, or do governments and the community have important roles too? How do we progress towards a more circular economy in South Australia? What are the institutions and the specific collaborations of state and public authorities, businesses and society needed to give us the prosperous, more socially inclusive and sustainable future we want? I want to give you an example of practical innovation and practical entrepreneurship by government as well as by Flinders University, in which I am proud to have played a role when I was Economic Advisor to then Premier Mike Rann and later when I headed the state's industry department. This was the redevelopment of the former auto assembly plant at Tonsley Park to become the Tonsley Innovation Precinct, which will give South Australia a knowledge centre and an advanced manufacturing hub for decades to come. It wasn't necessarily always going to happen that way. The development required the state to be a patient investor. Faster returns to the state could have come from almost immediate redevelopment of the site through sale for bulky goods and commercial and residential users, and there were plenty urging us to do just that. But that would not have delivered the same broader and deeper economic benefits that could only come over a longer time, focused on the harder task of building knowledge-intensive industries. Here then was the state being an entrepreneur and a practical innovator, and Flinders University too. Today, the Tonsley Innovation Precinct is a multi-award-winning example of environmentally responsive regeneration and transformation. The site has been replenished by enlightened planning, great architecture, engineering and design. And while a great deal remains to be done, what is happening there already is inspiring. And Tonsley is absolutely the right site for the forthcoming Powering the Change to a Circular Economy conference over 15th to the 16th of November, an event hosted by Flinders University through the Australian Industrial Transformation Institute in collaboration with Uni SA, Green Industries SA, Life Cycles and Comms House. So I invite you to this important conference. Now, as members of the audience for this Investigator Lecture, each of you is encouraged to participate and engage through the talk via live event polling. This will enable Dr Kansara to respond and incorporate your insights into her lecture to provide local perspectives and local relevance to the broader and global issues of her address. We want this to be an interactive audience event, so we invite you to use your smartphone to vote on topics, to comment and to ask questions during Tia's lecture. Please log on to the polling website on screen and to take a look at Tia's questions. The event is being streamed as a Facebook Live event. Please also remember to turn your phone to silent. I'm now delighted to be able to welcome to the stage Flinders University's Vice-Chancellor, Professor Colin Sterling.
Thank you, Lance. And it's a great pleasure. I'm delighted to be able to welcome you all to this flagship event, and it's the highlight of Flinders University's annual lecture series, the 2017 Investigator Lecture. Before I start, though, I would like to also pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Kaurna people, and to their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge, of course, our guest speaker, Dr Tia Kansara, esteemed guests, elected representatives, local, state, federal. Flinders University Chancellor Stephen Gerlach sends his apologies. He's in Sydney this evening and couldn't attend. But also Flinders University colleagues, students, and I see, and I've already met this evening already, a number of you who are alumni of Flinders, so welcome, and ladies and gentlemen. Thanks, of course, Lance, as Master of Ceremonies, and as you say, Director of Industry Transformation in the Innovative Manufacturing Cooperative Research Centre, the CRC, and part, of course, of Flinders Australian Industrial Transformation Institute based there at Tonsley. Now, Flinders University is committed to fostering a vibrant and engaged community that has the opportunity to learn, to develop, and to grow through knowledge exchange, through shared understanding, and of course through collaboration. And it's why we're delighted to be partnering in the 2017 Open State Festival to help foster new ideas and to hear from enterprising individuals and thought leaders to share their visions of the future. Now, of course, the annual Investigator Lecture is itself an important event in the Flinders University calendar, and it's part of our public education programme and part of our contribution to the cultural life, of course, here in South Australia. It's named after the HMS Investigator, the ship that our namesake, Captain Matthew Flinders, sailed and circumnavigated Australia back in 1802. His intrepid spirit we like to keep alive in the university named after him, and we're very proud to bring creative thinking and creative thinkers through this lecture series to challenge conventional wisdom. And tonight's speaker, Dr Tia Kansara, lives by principles for contemporary living that have a resonance with research being undertaken at Flinders, and especially in the areas of industrial transformation and diversification. And of course, we live in technologically and socially very disruptive times. Pace of change we hear every day seems to be accelerating. But change now is a vital part of Australia's future and its future prosperity. And I think Flinders has played a distinguished role and continues to do so in this area. And we are, as Lance indicated, a central part of the Tonsley Innovation Precinct, and born out of the closure and the regeneration of the former Mitsubishi manufacturing site. And as we've heard, one now of Australia's most awarded sites for sustainability and design. But it's also a hub for cutting-edge research, and research aimed to identify new technologies to solve environmental challenges. And so in a way, Tonsley becomes an example of enlightened practice and industrial transformation from which there are many lessons, I think, to be learned. Now, of course, as Vice-Chancellor of a university, I'm very privileged to hold that position. But I sometimes hear criticisms of universities. Universities, in some quarters, criticize universities for adopting some corporate culture, for being interested only in the bottom line. But I would suggest to you that the work Flinders is doing, and especially the work Flinders has been doing at Tonsley, demonstrates that view, frankly, to be nonsense. Yes, we strive to be financially sustainable. It's a vital part of being a modern university. But that is not the sole driver of our institution. Instead, we prize many other things, most notably the impacts that we have on social issues, in environmental issues, and of course on the broader economy, beyond the university, but the economy that fuels the state and of course the nation. And our mission as a university is to change lives and change the world. And that is something I think that speaks to the enormous impact that the higher education sector has on society at large. But of course, universities are not perfect. There are many things that we can do or could do more effectively. And so, of course, I look forward to learning more through events such as this one. Tonight, we'll hear from Dr. Tia Kansara. Tia is an award-winning entrepreneur and founder and director of Replenish Earth Limited, of 1000 Network Limited, and the sustainable design specialists Kansara Hackney Limited. She has a PhD from University College London, where her research focused on designing future cities. Tia launched the world's Replenish Index, and her advice on sustainability is in demand from multinational companies and governments around the world. I have no doubt that this evening she will illuminate and provoke thought in near equal measure with her philosophy of living footprintless in the world. It is therefore my great pleasure to invite Dr. Tia Kansara to deliver the 2017 Investigator Lecture. Thank you.
Hi everybody, how are you feeling? Oh, it's wonderful to be here, and what a place and what an audience. And thank you very, very much for taking this time out of your really busy schedules this evening so that we can have this time to actually go through some of the deeper questions that not only myself am asking, but also we share as a community. So at first I would like to say a very big thank you to the traditional owners of the land, to Flinders University for inviting me to such a prestigious lecture, but also to the Open State, because had I not have come to the Open State, I wouldn't have had this opportunity to come and have a chat with you. Now, you'll be aware, sorry, I'm gonna walk over here. If I can see the slides, here we go. So we're going to be live on Facebook. This means anybody who's on the Facebook Live can answer any of the questions that we're going to be posting there. All of the questions that we've got on the poll are one by one, and you'll be able to answer them using your phones. If you don't have a phone, don't worry about it. Ask the person next to you. Perhaps they do. You can tweet on Tia Kansara, Open State SA, and Flinders. And also, just in terms of the actual questions, we're going to have them one by one, but the next question might already be on there. Straight after you've answered, so feel comfortable to forward plan and answer with a little bit of thought. I think with that, we're almost ready to go with my lecture. This lecture really has been one of the most exciting lectures that I'll be giving, and for me it's really an opportunity not only to share the Replenish Earth philosophy, but also to dig deeper into some of the questions that not only myself asks, but the questions that we're now going to be able to ask you, so that you are just as much a part of the actual lecture as I am. We're testing this for the very first time, so fingers crossed that it works. You'll get a lot of the answers on the actual screen, and hopefully I'll be able to pick up some of your answers and incorporate them into the actual presentation. So don't be shy. That was my message. So, first question on your polls as well. Is climate change real? So I'm going to allow you to answer that question, and whilst you're answering that question, I'm also going to add a few more notes that I've got on climate change. In front of you here, you have a slide that shows the sort of distribution of CO2 across the world. And what's actually happening in recent decades is the changes in the climate that have actually caused incredible impacts on the natural and human systems on all continents and across the oceans, as you can see in the map here. Evidence of climate change impact is actually at its strongest and most comprehensive for natural systems, meaning that it's actually in the natural systems that we're becoming much more aware of their impact. And that's also because of species extinction, bleaching of the coral reefs, as you will have seen already in the Great Barrier Reef. Some impacts, however, on human systems have also been attributed to climate change, with a major or minor contribution of climate change distinguishable from other influences as well. In many regions, we'll see that the precipitation or melting of snow and also the impact of anthropogenic factors on climate change are altering hydrological systems, affecting water resources in terms of quantity and quality. Glaciers continue to shrink almost worldwide due to climate change, affecting runoffs and water resources downstream. In other words, not only are the impacts of climate change affecting our natural systems, a lot of the water that is running off is increasing the amount of sea level rise. We're seeing rises in sea levels, an increase in water-related disasters like floods. We've also experienced many of the actual water bodies diminishing in certain parts of the world. And there is this almost very strange permafrost warming that is occurring, that is actually thawing some of the high altitude regions that we have. Many of the terrestrial freshwater and marine species have also shifted their geographic ranges, and you'll see that here. And if I point to Australia, you'll see that damage to aquatic ecosystems due to decreased stream flow and increased salinity is actually having a huge impact across Australia. Increase in the heat in urban environments, so that's relating to the heat island effect. You will have noticed that there are a number of blackouts that are occurring across Australia from the extreme heats. And then relating that also to the impact on agriculture, forestry, and other land uses. I'm going to go to my next slide now. While only a few recent species extinctions have actually been attributed as yet to climate change, natural global climate change at rates slower than current anthropogenic climate change cause significant ecosystem shifts. This is actually a photograph taken in Australia. And what we're seeing is that these beautiful photographs taken by a marine biologist are actually turning into graveyards underwater and having a huge impact also on the ecosystem. This we can see that the bleaching of the coral reef is also reducing the amount of sequestration that is possible through them. So my next question, are you responsible for the climate changing? Now, I'm aware that we have some previous questions that have been answered, and I'd love to pull them out onto the main screen. Is that possible? This is where we get to see what you've been thinking. Ooh, wow. Is climate change real? Who's that 1%? What was the answer to the next question? Are you at risk of climate change? Who is that 2%? And the next question, please. Are you responsible for the climate changing? And that's fascinating. So we have an audience. Oh, wow. Oh, whoa, it's changing. It's changing. Hold it there, hold it there. We liked it at 94%. And it's such an interesting statistic. I wonder why it is that you feel like that, and what it is, either scientifically or emotionally, that has led you to that conclusion. What kind of information has allowed you to have that level of consciousness about this topic, which is so very, very important. I'm now going to go to my next slide. Do we have any more questions that we have unanswered? No. Brilliant. Right. Next slide, please. Boom-de-boom. The annual anthropogenic CO2 emissions. Here we can see an actual rise in the full range thanks to the IPCC's annual report 5. And what we've got here really shows that not only are the actual cumulative CO2 emissions increasing and having a huge impact on warming of the globe, but the relationship of that to the 1 to 2%, 1 to 2 degree increase in temperature globally. What that then relates to on an economic front is the amount of greenhouse gases that are related to the different sectors. Here you can see that one of the largest is related to electricity, heat production, or I'm also going to add cooling. This is actually one of my favorite slides. And the reason why I like it so much is because you've got the changes that are in the climate system, but also the socioeconomic processes, including the adaptation and the mitigation on the right, are the drivers and hazards, but also the vulnerability and the exposure. It's actually remarkable how much of the climate shifting is having impacts on certain parts of the world, and yet other parts of the world are not seeing the changes that are being experienced. We've got, in terms of the adaptation and mitigation actions, one such interesting suggestion, and that is, what kind of activities can you in the public, you in a citizenship, you as a member of Australia's country, both in terms of a person who is investing into the system, investing into the economy, but also as an individual with your own thoughts and your own vulnerability to the CO2 emissions. And what this does, it really shows us what kind of risks are we looking at and how we can mitigate them. There's an incredible report. I really do suggest that if you have a moment to read through the annual report of the IPCC, but also to go into a further information on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Are you aware of the UN SDGs? That's going to be my next question. And let's see if we can put the answers on real time. Wow, almost 50-50. Cool, interesting. That's really interesting. So the Sustainable Development Goals are the continuation from the Millennium Development Goals, which were launched in order for the climate to be at the basis of carbon neutrality, as well as our markets and governments and policies to be aligned with some of the biggest challenges. So my next slide is the 2030 Agenda, which is what the United Nations used to launch the Sustainable Development Goals. There are a number of these goals that now relate to the environment, they relate to water consumption or energy consumption, they relate to sustainable cities or smart cities, they relate to poverty alleviation, 17 in total. And what the aim is for the SDGs is by 2030 to have in every single one of these 17 categories to tackle the subtopics. And this is the reason why I mention this and the Sustainable Development Goals, not only because you can go into much more detail by researching them and finding out which one relates to your industry, but it's actually it's the depth at which and the detail with which each of the goals has been initiated. And I mean, if you look specifically, say, at goal number 13, which addresses the changes in the climate, and it poses the risks to agriculture, the security of water supply, for food protection, for ecosystem. And I think in terms of the actual report itself, it's such an interesting study on what it is, because a lot of the Millennium Development Goals, which were the predecessors for the SDGs, have actually been met. And it's by having this vision that the United Nations has had on one side that we can go into much more depth of the level of granularity that is required in this shift towards this sustainable development or this sustainable economy. I'm now going to move on to something that I feel quite deeply about, and it really does go back to the time when I was reading my first degree, and that was in economics, and I felt like I was not really aligned with the economics of the time, and I felt that there was no other alternative. I felt as if the GDP that was being both recognized but used as a metric was something that really didn't look beyond one part of the full ecosystem, and that was looking specifically only at income. But saying nothing about wealth, saying nothing about assets, and definitely not saying anything about the environment or the social systems. And it's because of this that over the last 12 years, I've really started to become more aware of the larger implications of the GDP. So that not only as a measure of success, but also in terms of expenditure being used, doesn't matter what you spend that money on, but as long as you're spending, it looks very, very good on GDP. So long-term development and the accumulation of assets in terms of capital are actually seen as a positive rather than a negative. And the impact or the externalities on the environment are not included. As the Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz says, a private company is judged by both its income and balance sheet, but most countries only compile an income statement, that's a GDP, and know very little about the national balance sheet. The other major limitations of GDP are that the representation of natural capital. The full contribution of natural capital like the forests, wetlands, and agricultural land doesn't even show up. Forestry is an example. Timber resources are counted in national accounts, but the other services of the forest aren't included, like carbon sequestration and air filtration are ignored. Now we're looking at cities that are so smartly created in such ways that these sensors are collecting all of the information that are required in order for us to make these kind of decisions. But why is it that no matter how many of these sensors we've got, they still don't reduce the amount of electricity that is needed in order for us to have a low CO2 footprint? It all sort of forms an ecosystem. And what becomes a really interesting factor, aside from the externalities, is where on the supply chain do we stop accounting for the measure of the impact on the environment? So for example, if you were to have, let's say you purchased a piece of clothing. Let's say you purchased the piece of clothing that you're wearing today. Where is it that you purchased the piece of clothing from? And who, all the way from the actual primary resource, has been involved in making the actual clothing, creating the designs for it, tailoring them, sending them, distributing them, showcasing them. Perhaps you went shopping and found the top that you're wearing. Where is it that it comes from? And all along that supply chain, you will have a number of people that are involved in that process. When we actually calculate CO2 emissions, are we actually going into the level of depth that we require? I'm going to give you an example. There was a really interesting project in Abu Dhabi, and it's called a zero carbon, zero waste city. It's called Masdar City. It's one of the cities that has had a lot of media exposure. It's a city that was designed in master plan terms by Norman Foster, Lord Norman Foster in the UK. He's a very famous master planner, but also an architect. And the city was designed so that the people who are living in the city would actually live a zero carbon, zero waste lifestyle. But what, in practical terms, does that actually feel like? And as you enter the actual city, at the moment it's the core plans of the city that are not yet constructed. All you find is a university complex in the center of the actual urban plan. As soon as you enter, the whole city works on it being 100% controlled. It's a controlled environment. You walk in, there's nothing that you can change, not even the fact that you have a 3-minute shower. Its relationship with the rest of the impact, so it's constructed in the middle of the desert, and it has taken a considerable amount of time to get all of the resources to the location in order for just those buildings to be constructed. It has taken a considerable amount of resources, and they've all been transported there. Where have they come from? And how do you sequester the first part of its development, which is effectively the designs of it? Where does everything come from? Is it local? When I first had a conversation with Masdar, as the institute or the city, they hadn't actually calculated their CO2 footprint up until the time that it was operational. And this is really shocking for me, because as soon as I entered, the first question that I had was, have you sequestered everything up until now? And this was a really interesting project for them to take on. Where is it that all of our materials have come from? And if we start to sequester everything that we've done in the past, then how also can we include the sequestration process for everything that we do in the future? So just as much as Mazda has had this a very interesting, in-depth project of finding out where on the supply chain they have had an impact on the environment, I'm also going to invite you to ask that question to yourself as well. Where is it in your lives that you have an impact on the environment, and are you aware of it? I'm now going to return back to my slides. Thank you. And I've got a little message that was videoed specifically for you. It's from Jaime Lerner. He is one of the most inspiring architects and urban planners in the world. He has been the mayor of Curitiba. He's been local governor of the state of Parana, and he's also a very dear friend. And this is his message. He's also doing the current urban plans and an update on the urban plans for Rio. So as soon as you go there, you will have an incredible example of the fingers, the green fingers that he's used to penetrate through the city. He's talking about replenish, and I just wanted him to put it into his words what it meant. And so the first part of this is really to appreciate how this affects somebody like him, somebody who actually gets to vision what a city looks like and feels like, somebody who gets to design the experience that you are having, like the room that we're in right now. So we're going to play this.
I wanted to explain sustainability. I'm obsessed about the idea to teach children about sustainability in a very simple way. For instance, sustainability is an equation between what we save and what we waste. So, save more, waste less. But if you waste zero, sustainability goes to infinitum. Okay, this is very simple how to show, for instance, regarding water supply, regarding energy. But I think we are in a moment where we can go further. That means it's more than just saving more and wasting less. It's much more. You have to save much more. You have to be committed to have much more. And this is linked to a word which is replenished.
Thank you. So the time has come for a new economic model, but what does that economic model look like? I believe incorporating national and natural capital into our accounts can support better decisions. Our goal, therefore, not just mine, ours, is a world where measuring and valuing the environment leads to better decisions for development. It leads to better businesses. It leads to providing detailed statistics for better management of the economy, like accounts for the output of pollution that are needed to model green growth scenarios. I'm introducing the World Replenish Index, or the WRI. The WRI can help countries rich in biodiversity like yours design a management strategy that maximizes the contribution to economic growth while balancing the trade-offs among the actual new economies that are coming into practice, like ecotourism or agricultural work that we're actually introducing, virtual gardens into the cities, livelihoods that really do rely on the environment, and other ecosystem services that we may or may not be aware of. There are a number of different economic measures that we can include into the WRI, and some of that has actually already been included through the work of WAVES, and that is the World Bank's initiative to start including these natural accounting systems into the economy. It's going to take some time, and I think we're going to really need your help. Next slide, please. Ooh. Here we go. So the World Replenish Index is one aspect of many. It includes the circular economy. It includes cradle to cradle. It includes the word ethicpreneurship. What it does is it allows for innovation to go beyond just simple creativity. It goes through a vision. And that vision is to give more than we're taking. It is not to sustain the status quo, but go beyond the status quo. It is to question how we can give more. How is it that in 10, 20, 30 years' time, we can create systems through an accountability system? Naturally, there are a number of examples that hold true. And I think those business models that allow for us to move beyond charities or enterprises which are non-profit to actually seek out finance through business models that are appropriate. So this is my question to you right now. How might we create business models that replenish planet Earth? How might we create business models that replenish planet Earth? How is it that we can design economic systems that will allow us to make finance for ourselves to create this economic model that will work on that one vision of giving more than we're taking? Imagine if you were to design a city on that basis, design a city with that vision. It would mean a physical platform that would be so in tune with nature, so in tune with natural systems, so in tune with the ecosystem. Of course, that's a vision. And of course, it's going to take steps to get there. So we're going to look at some of the answers, and we've got some really good ones here. Putting a price on carbon emissions was a good model for encouraging business to think about the environment. It's really interesting with the autonomous vehicles that are coming in the States. There's a really good article on DX Labs, you can Google this, and they've written about 4 million truck drivers that will be out of jobs if these autonomous driverless vehicles are going to come into the market. So the question is, who pays? Who pays for the 4 million people that will be out of a job? On the one side, you've got the employees who are thinking, well, now I'm out of a job, it's your fault. On the other side, you've got, well, you knew about it years in advance, so what did you do to prevent that situation occurring? On the other side, you've got governments who are figuring out taxation systems. Do you tax the robots? Do you tax the system? Do you tax the people? Where does the responsibility lie? Just a side note. Carbon neutrality, sustainability solutions, community involvement, and consultation in business development. Wow. I find that community involvement depends on the consciousness of the people that you're working with. And it really does go from a vision like the agenda that has been set by the Premier of carbon neutrality into much more tangible, individual, granular decisions that are made by the actual community. And it's such an interesting way of bringing actions, individual actions, and acknowledging the cost of those actions. And I see here also the cost of inaction in what we are doing and what we're not doing. We have another response which is really interesting. Government financial support for innovations and programs that replenish. Exactly. Who was it that said that? Yes, thank you. Government financial support, this is really interesting. So we look at the subsidies that have been provided for renewable energy. We look at the subsidies that have been provided for many of the new initiatives that have been included. But why is it that making and designing the accelerators, making and designing platforms that can actually really introduce this sort of vision into the city, why is it that these are so much more difficult to do? I'm going to take the example of Copenhagen. In a project that was with Cisco, what they decided to do was actually open up the city. So you have these areas that are called urban commons, and these urban commons are spaces in between. They're like the areas in the city that everybody shares. And in these urban commons, they decided that they were going to open up the city as a platform, invite all of the entrepreneurs who are working in the lighting industry, and provide them a physical space to put all of their lighting instruments in so that they can compare. Because the government needed to give a contract out, and instead of a typical reference point or report that they would need to write, what they did was actually gave the public the opportunity to come and experience the variety of innovations in the lighting industry. And what was really fascinating about this project was, A, that they'd opened up the city as a platform, and B, that the actual citizens were engaged with the decision making. And that's an interesting example of the actual government opening up the city. So there are so many different mechanisms of opening up the city, not just physically, but also on an entrepreneurial level, like the hackathons, like city hackathons. There was one in Buenos Aires in 2014, where they opened up the city and said, all right, hackers, come, we're inviting you, and these are the challenges that we have. See what you can do with the data. And I'm really hoping that OpenState will also lead to a lot of data being available for hackers or data scientists or people like ourselves who are interested in taking the data and understanding what's happening on a level that can then lead to innovations that we never knew could exist. So we're going to go to the next slide, please. Brilliant. Coming back to businesses. A really interesting tool that's used by a lot of entrepreneurs is the business canvas model. And so I've hacked that. I've put replenish on there. And I've invited all of the entrepreneurs, including all the startup entrepreneurs, to ask the questions that they would, but with a lens of replenish. And that is that when you're starting your business, ask the questions about what the impact to the environment will be. Where do your materials come from? What is the impact on the supply chain? Who is involved in your business? Who are your customers? What happens to your product at the end? So this is the Replenish Business Canvas. And the aim of the canvas is really to introduce startups and entrepreneurs, people who would like to take their research into entrepreneurship mode and ask the questions at the beginning rather than asking them at the end. This is not, many a time we come across a lot of the questions that people ask at the end. Now that they've figured out a business model that works and they've got some money in the bank, they want to put something back. They want to give something back to the environment or the community. And this is a great way of, instead of doing it right at the end, where the damage has already been done, actually introducing it right at the beginning, where you can mitigate that from get-go. I'm now going to ask you the next question. What does your replenished lifestyle feel like here in Adelaide? There was a really interesting question that was asked at the carbon neutral talk earlier, and that was, but how do we make it affordable? And where are the places in Adelaide that we can go to that we can live a carbon neutral lifestyle? Well, Replenish is going a little bit beyond that. Ooh, we've already got some answers. Let's have a look. Too much urban sprawl. Is there a size of the city that is appropriate? I remember asking somebody in Brussels about the size of Brussels, and his response was, I really like Brussels because I can get from one side to the other in 15 minutes. How big is too big? There was a really interesting article written by Doxiadis, Konstantinos Doxiadis. You'll love his work. He's an urban planner, and much of his work related to putting cities into human organisms. So he said that a city has a heart, and the heart of the city being kind of like a heart of the human. If the body of the human gets too big, the heart can no longer look after the body. And in the same way, like Adelaide, if the heart can no longer manage the size of the city, it might be time to create a new heart. And in urban examples across the world, you will have seen examples like London or New York, where they have polycentric cities. And these polycentric cities are where there are multiple hearts in the actual city. In London, you have the example through some research that was done by Foster and Partners about the little area around Notting Hill, and that because everything could be accessible within 1 kilometre squared of walking, that was a great example of a densely packed environment that had all the amenities that you needed when you needed them. So there's a school available, there's the supermarkets, there's the work, there's a metro station, and all of these other factors that come into urban planning. Can I go back to the answers, please? Need to challenge the assumption that growth is good. There's a really interesting book called Limits to Growth by Meadows that was or Beyond Growth and Beyond the Limits. They're both looking at computer assimilations on what will happen if we continue at the rate that we are. I recommend that book. Measure true economic and social cost of buildings, food, lifestyle, and choices. If you had a CO2 like kind of coming back to the carbon neutrality, if you had a lifestyle diet for CO2, what would that diet look like? Like if we, or replenish, or any of these terms, but if you had, let's say, a calorie count that you had associated to your living a rather healthy lifestyle, in a similar manner, if you had a CO2 lifestyle that you were allowed for Adelaide, in order for everybody in Adelaide to meet the target of the reduction, what would that lifestyle look like? I'm going to go back to my presentation, please. Great. Some of the research that I've been doing has been related to what is now called the fourth industrial revolution. In some ways, it's a really interesting take on the future of technology and how that impacts our lives. Here, you have an image from an article that I wrote. It was a sci-fi piece, and it's about how neural-laced technology, which is something that Elon Musk has actually invested in, neural-laced technology is fitted at the back of your head and is incorporated into your brain. So your neurons and the neural lace are connected in a way, kind of like this brain, where you can actually map out all of the knowledge and understanding of that brain. What's really interesting about this, and say in the future this could be a potential, is that this could then relate to everybody's brain being uploaded. So imagine here in this room, everyone's brains being uploaded. I wanted to write this piece having watched some of the Black Mirror episodes, which are really interesting. And I see some nods. There's a really, there's a big invitation with a lot of these series that is, the technology is already there, but what does it mean to us? The technology like Neuralace is almost there. Other technologies you'll see, like a counting system or smart grids that we see and dashboards that we see, smart meters and metrics that we have, like a dashboard at home, kind of like Nest, that sort of extends and or the ability for you to automate your home and tell Alexa to turn the lights down. I'm going to go back. What's really interesting about the actual sci-fi piece is that it can then relate to visioning what will happen in the future, but in terms of the actual technology. And what this has allowed me to do, and I invite you to do something quite similar, is get creative with the actual examples of replenishing your life. What I did with the World Replenish Index was to create a little story. It's a two-part story. And the first part really goes into details of the actual characters. And having written it, what I realized was that it was okay for the audience to read the piece. It was okay for the audience to watch the actual interesting, pieces of Black Mirror. But because it's not real, somehow we were invited to have the conversation. Had it have been real, we'd be much more afraid. And so what's happening is the opportunity to have these deep discussions and organize these conversations so that we can learn way more about the topic and the implications of them. Coming back to the example of the autonomous vehicles and what happens to the 4 million people in the US once they've lost their jobs, if there is prevention and if there is that conversation, perhaps it would lead to better decision making. Perhaps it would lead to policy decisions. Perhaps it would lead to research projects. I'm quite curious about what the audience feels about the next question, which is, if we can have it on screen, please. What advice or skills do our current students need for the future? And I'm going to call myself a student here as well. What advice or skills do our current students need for the future? How prepared is prepared? How can we prevent ourselves from losing the jobs that we have, but actually creating the jobs for the future? What kind of skills are necessary for that future? What kind of talents do we need? What kind of shifts are we experiencing both through these exponential technologies like the ones that I mentioned, but also those that are unimaginable? There are a number of jobs that we don't even know exist. In 10 years' time, we're probably going to have job descriptions that we never knew could even be job descriptions. I remember when I was at the annual Financial Review Summit in Sydney a week and a bit ago, there was a minister of the digital economy. And I remember, or you know, that as a title, or that even as a subject about 10 to 15 years ago, probably wouldn't have come into our lips. We wouldn't have said that. So how is it that these skills that we're acquiring today and the educational systems that we're providing for our students will prepare not only us for the future and the jobs that are going to be created, but also individually, how are we going to prepare our children for that? So I'm going to go back to the answers. Students in different study areas need to work and learn together. Students, business, startups, industry, all side by side. This is interesting because there's a convergence of the actual ecosystem. Interdisciplinary thinking and actions, businesses coming together almost as if they are neighboring partners. Students in different study areas need to work and learn together, holding people accountable, becoming independent thinkers, questioning the status quo, systems thinking, developing skills and seeing problems from different angles, converging, crowdocratic decision-making platforms. Perhaps there are methods that now we can actually collect, just like now, thoughts from each and every single one of you that goes on screen, perhaps even educates one another. There are studies to actually show that the environments that we create can have a huge impact on our brain. So it's not just the fact that we're working together collaboratively, but it's the design of the physical environment that can have a huge impact, not only on your well-being, but on your brain. There's research that shows that being in a specific environment can have an impact on the way that your brain functions. All of the senses are at play as soon as you enter this room and you're sitting down and you can sense exactly the environment around you. You become much more aware, not only physiologically, but psychologically, it has an impact on you. There are certain studies on colors, like chromotherapy, that can have an impact on you as well. I'm going to go to the next slide, please. This is one of the rather interesting areas that I sense that there will be a massive impact, I think, on all of our jobs and positions in the future, but also the businesses that we're going to have. And that is related to artificial intelligence. The term was actually coined by John McCarthy, and he was an American computer scientist, and he had created the first ever study on the discipline at Dartmouth Conference in 1956. It's now given the sort of umbrella description for a lot of different things, but actually there are a number of positions that we're going to have, a number of things that are going to be impacting our lives and the way that data is then used to make decisions, and how those decisions are made either by us or by others. Here is a little diagram of some of the work that DX Labs is doing, including some of the work that they've done with Replenish Earth Limited. And here you see the kind of thinking that goes behind the design of something, to the design of photovoltaic walls, like you will find that the Tesla is researching, so that not only is the car appropriate for energizing itself, but by its solar power can also charge itself, save the energy in its batteries, and then be used to power the home. So it has dual functions, and what we're finding, just as much as different university students will come together to incorporate their learnings and collaborate, we're seeing also multiple uses of just a car. So not only is it an energy storage system, it's a way of transporting you around the city, but it's also a way of charging up your home. So this is some of the examples that we're seeing in the industry. My next question is on vision. I'm a strong believer in the future of cities or the future of business. But in terms of this, I would love to know what the future you is. The future you in the future place, in the future business, purchasing the future products. What kind of a lifestyle would you like to live? And if we are to achieve that carbon neutrality, what kind of future lifestyle would you like to experience? Through your senses, imagine for a moment, close your eyes, I'm going to transport you forward 50 years. And as you're transporting yourself 50 years hence, you're having a moment and you're realizing the physical space around you. What does it look like? What kind of things do you see? How is the environment impacting the way that you're thinking? Does it look different to the environment that you have today? How does it look different? What are the colors that are inspiring you? Who are the creative directors of the films that will be on the cinema screens? What kind of augmented reality will shift your experience? All of these different experiences are those that can be visioned. And if and when you have that question, how might we be able to make that a reality? The first part of that vision is really to ask the question. And the second part of that is to make it a reality. I'm really hoping that the future jobs will allow us to converge in order for us to use a lot of the tasks that we have next to do in a way that can impact not only yourself and the vision that you will have, but also the future of the environment that you want to create for the people that you love most. I'm now going to my next slide, please. I think we've done that. If we were to ask this question quite specifically, what might we expect in 10 years' time? Think of the environment of Australia, of Adelaide, and in Adelaide, what would you expect to see? So in 10 years' time, in Adelaide, that's 2027, what will Adelaide look like from an environmental perspective? Can we have a look at the answers? Ooh. A division between those who will work to replenish the planet and those who want to retain the current economic system. A proper understanding that the economy and the environment can work hand in hand and work together to benefit communities. I fear disaster. But hope for environment becomes central to all government and business decisions. Economic downturn, more capitalistic behavior, little abating of environmental destruction, more corruption to bypass environmental standards, a wider breadth of educated communities in sustainability or replenishment. Really interesting there. What do you do next? You enlist momentum. You find the actions that will prepare you and prevent the disasters from occurring. Find the people that have done it already. Who's already been out there, answer the question, and has got the t-shirt? And there are so many wonderful examples of people who have really challenged what it means to live a sustainable lifestyle or a replenishing lifestyle. But it also means that there are opportunities, and this is the reason for my next slide, which is with the World Economic Forum suggesting that that investment gap is worth about $2.5 trillion. It's exactly where we're going to be, but where is that money going to be spent? If that's what that shift and that gap is worth, How much of that can be yours, and how much of that can you play a considerable part in? Who are the kind of people that will be part of this step change? Are you ready for the replenish economy? I think one really interesting factor here is how much of, how much of what we know so far are we willing to let go of? And as the Premier said at the opening launch of Open State yesterday, he said, we don't have a dearth of new ideas. We have an issue of letting go of old ideas. If, as soon as you walk through that door, you start again, what would the ideas be that you would be leaving in this room? What would the ideas be that have been holding you back? What have the economic situations led to in the past that you can now let go of and not be part of? What have you spent your money on in the past that you no longer need to spend money on in the future? What kind of economic opportunities would you now like to seek going forward? And more importantly, what kind of leadership do you feel is necessary today? And where are those leaders exampled? I think there was another very beautiful message that the Premier had also mentioned, and that was that instead of feeling overwhelmed with what's happening both in the climate but also what's happening in the economic system, anticipate it, be ready for it, create the future that you would like to see. I think Adelaide has got an incredible list of opportunities, and some of them are about the different kind of stakeholder models that you can explore, community architecture, that you can include communities in architecting the future of their urban environments, but also the kind of strategies that are necessary as action plans. Here we go. Right. We have another question. How might we design cities to align with the changing climate? If we take Adelaide as an example, and if you were to use one example from Adelaide that could really help Adelaide, and for many of the people that are watching online to know your results, what would you suggest? Sustainable public transport, car-free, green, and with advanced water-sensitive design. We need to start designing cities for people, not cars. If you were to take the cars out of the city, would everybody walk? A city that is pedestrian and bike-friendly is healthier for the environment and us humans. Turning our suburbs into hubs rather than sprawls. That goes back to the polycentricity of the city. Fantastic. Taken the urban heat island effect into consideration, design buildings with potential natural impacts in mind. There is a fantastic method for designing buildings in Japan because they have so many earthquakes. And what they do is at the base of the building, and I'm happy to share this with you later, they have these sort of rubber systems at the bottom of the building, and some of these buildings are extremely tall, like 40 plus floors. And what they have are these sort of springs, rubber springs. So as soon as the earthquake comes up to about a Richter scale of 7, the building will move and it will nudge and it will, sway, but it won't break. And so the actual disaster prevention is designed into the building itself. That's an example in Japan. But I'm sure there are many other things like cooling buildings naturally. I don't know if you notice, if you're walking down the street and you have the cooling system that is the fan that is then an extractor on the outside of the building. It's a really hot day in Adelaide. Imagine walking down the street and all of a sudden you come across this really hot fan. And that is the heat that is coming out of the building, then going around the front entrance and going back in. I think there's an interesting opportunity here to include a lot of the projects like living laboratories or city laboratories, opening up the city to really allow for some of the challenges that Adelaide has, and inviting all of you, all of the public, in order for them to be involved in those sort of visions. Coming back to my slides, what I do have is some really interesting examples from Flinders University and some examples of Replenish projects that have actually caught our attention. This is CNU. It's a new health food product developed by Flinders University Centre for Marine Bioproducts Development and the CSIRO. It's a calcium-rich dietary supplement aimed at 50% of Australians who aren't getting enough calcium in their diet. It's 100% non-dairy, and it's actually made from a lobster shell and seaweed extract. Researchers at Flinders have found ways to extract key compounds in nutritious bioproducts that would otherwise be discarded, so it's actually a waste product. And during the processing, packaging of Australian rock lobsters, this is what's being created. Next slide. This is by Justin Chalker, Green Chemistry and Ameliorating Mercury Pollution in the Environment. The chemical industry has quite the public image problem, but environmentally green chemistry is real and can make a significant positive impact in the Replenish economy. Dr. Chalker is a senior researcher and lecturer in synthetic chemistry here at the university, and he's developed a synthetic polymer product that can remove mercury pollution from the environment. We call it green chemistry, he says, because this polymer is made from natural sulfur and recycled canola cooking oil. Mercury pollution is a huge problem across the Earth. The main sources are emissions from coal-burning power stations and the use of mercury in gold mining. Mercury in the environment bioaccumulates up the food chain. So it starts with algae in water. The algae is eaten by other organisms, which are eaten by the fish, which are eaten by larger fish, before ending up on our dinner plate in the seafood we eat. If we can address mercury pollution at the source, we can prevent further environmental damage from occurring. Here, Tonsley Building. Many of you will have heard of Tonsley, formerly the Mitsubishi Motors site. It's now home to Australia's first innovation precinct, of which Flinders University is the major tenant. The whole Tonsley redevelopment has been recognised as a world leader in environmentally minded design and building practice, with a 6-star Green Star community certification from the Green Building Council of Australia, recognising Tonsley's smart energy grid system that reduces ongoing energy use and a water-conscious facility design. Flinders at Tonsley is really quite unlike any other university campus. The building incorporates flexible spaces that encourage the sharing of ideas and knowledge. Students, even at an undergraduate level, work directly alongside and with startups and established industries. It reminds me of a project in Dubai where the government has actually created an accelerator and suggested that all of the government departments be in one location, also inviting a lot of the startups to come and form their offices right next to these government departments. Next up, we have Professor Colin Raston's Vortex Fluidic Device, the VFD. This can refold proteins. You might have heard in the news that it can literally unboil an egg. It spins material at incredibly high speed to straighten out tangled molecules so they can fold back into their original shape. It allows more tightly controlled chemical processes to be formed, 100 times faster, and while reducing waste. The device itself is quite small. It looks like a fancy juicing machine you'd have in your kitchen, alongside your Vitamix, of course. And that's its real strength. It's transportable. You take it out in the field to disaster zones and remote developing regions, and it doesn't need a chemistry lab. It is the chemistry lab. The real application of this technology is the streamlining of plug-and-play production of life-saving medicines. This has been used to produce the crucial anesthetic, lidocaine, much faster while producing less waste than traditional methods. So there you have it, the VFD. It opens doors to a revolution in chemistry, biology, engineering, and medicine. Oh, I didn't want to show that yet. It's the next video, But before I leave you with one particular question, I've got a few more suggestions. How are we going to make this shift? We've seen some of the research that has been implemented at this university, but how are you going to do that? What is it that you're going to need? One of the suggestions that I have is invest in immersive experiences. These are physical experiences that you can walk into and be part of. This gives you an opportunity both in terms of learning, but also experiencing something at a completely different level. I think virtual reality is one way of doing it with the headsets like the Oculus Rift, so you can actually experience what it feels like. But I think the actual experience is priceless. And this is what I experienced with my students in Bhutan when I took them to Bhutan for the very first time from India. They were a little bit bored. They said, well, Bhutan's right next to our country. Why would we want to go there? But as soon as we arrived, they all ran off the bus. And one of the first things that they did was start taking selfies. And I wondered why it was that they were doing that. And it was the first time in their lives they had seen such clean water. And that was right next to them in Bhutan. So immersive experiences can have a huge impact. Some of my other students that I took to Japan had an interesting experience learning about waste segregation in Japanese homes. And you may be aware that the Japanese are extremely skilled. There's some places in Japan that have up to 32 different kinds of recycling that you have to sequester your items into. And so the students went and had a 2-day experience living in a Japanese home, only for them to have a bit of a culture shock. And at the end, well, first, when they had that culture shock, they thought, why do we have to be here? And at the end, they realized that they didn't want to go home anymore. They didn't want to go back to India. And so we had this lovely conversation before their trip to India, where they could actually put their immersive experience into practice when they were back in India. And it was a beautiful way for the students to appreciate what the big challenges were for India as well. I'm also going to ask, when the ability of thinking creatively is unleashed and collaboratively, they can have a huge impact on not only us as a vision, as a group of people, but it can be really inspiring to hear about the new ideas, projects, businesses, products that you've found. So please share them. I'm going to have a book that's coming out shortly called the World Replenish Index, surprise, surprise. I aim to showcase some of the business models, how to make the replenish economy financially viable. So they'll be in there, and I really hope that you'll remain in touch in order for you to find out more about the WRI as it comes into practice. I'll be visiting Bhutan in November to speak to the Prime Minister, because I'm really hoping that Bhutan will be the first country to implement it. Thank you very much for your time. I'm going to leave you with a little video. And the reason why I leave you with this video is primarily because the next 10 years are about being fearless. And when I saw this video, it really inspired me, not only because of the environment that the video is taken in, but the real message behind it. So thank you very much for your time. And I very much hope over the next 8 or 9 days that I'm here at the Open State that we'll have opportunities to interact. So I'm going to play the video now, if I may. Are you ready? Yes, they were sharks, but find the love in your fear. Thank you. Yes, it does.
I'm sure I speak on behalf of us all to thank Tia very much for an extremely interesting address. We're running a little short of time, but I thought it would be useful if we kept the proceedings going for another 10 minutes or so to allow 2 to 3 questions. There are roving mics in the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, please indicate. And before asking your question, tell us who you are. Give us your name.
Must be dying to ask questions.
Here. Tell us who you are.
Hi, my name's Callie. I'm from Flinders University. I'm a student in my 3rd year. I would love to do the work you're doing. What would you suggest I could do now?
Come and join me.
Excellent.
We need more people. Actually, the conservationist that had filmed the video, Michael, he was presenting at a summit a week and a half ago. And once I watched the video and his speech, and that was the first time that he was actually speaking about this topic of shark safety and conservation, he then said, how is it that I can do what you're doing? And similar questions. And I find it really interesting because I kind of joke about being an ecosystem designer. It's a job that has never been given before, and I've given it to myself. And so many of the jobs in the future won't be professions that we know about, but actually will use the skills that we've developed and that we're sensitive to. So really, aside from the joke of working with me, you're welcome to, of course, but actually finding the values, the core values that don't shift for you, and then converting them into practices and skills that you would like to apply those practices to. So one of the things that I did was to find out what my core values are, and then to translate that into an economic model, right, for myself. How am I going to earn money doing the things that I love doing? And it just so happens that working with governments and working with businesses and exploring sci-fi, who knew? But all of that is part of my creativity. And I didn't know it existed until I came across it. And then I got even more curious about it and wanted to find out what I could do. So it's really about translating what your learnings are and how that could actually be interpreted into a role specifically just for you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Over here.
Hello, my lady of the answer.
Hello. My name's Kay Bennett. I'm just an interested person who's committed myself to trying to leave the world as well as I inherited it. But you were talking about all the jobs that are going to disappear, and there will be jobs that are available, new jobs. But I wonder about a total rethink of the way we work. I remember, about 35 years ago, there was talk of reducing to a 30-hour week, and we've done the reverse. And, where do you see, I see that we could have a role that we could actually get out and enjoy this wonderful environment and be committed to working less hours per week in paid work and having everyone employed. What's your opinion of that?
Definitely think that work is overrated. The idea of working and not playing, I mean, imagine having to spend all your life working for the 2 hours in the evening that you get to enjoy it. How sad. How unfortunate. But it doesn't have to be that way. There are so many different things that people can do. I love what I do, and I'm just one example. There are many people out there that are finding and exploring what it means to work. I think if we were to take 2 words out of the dictionary, one would be waste and the other would be work. And all of a sudden you would get this, okay, what do I do with my life then? And it was so interesting because with this, the robotics and all the technology that is coming in, the big question is, what next? What are we going to do? What do you mean? I'm not going to work in that factory from 9 o'clock in the morning to 5 p.m. or 8 p.m. at night. What am I going to do with my life? Well, that's a good question. What would you like to do with your life? How would you like to spend your life? What kind of the things, do you find curious or that you would like to go and practice or learn about? I remember a taxi driver in the UK, we were having a lively debate, and he said, taxi drivers, we're going to have to figure out what to do with all of these Uber-type companies coming in and also these autonomous vehicles. And he said, I'm going to go back to school. This is my opportunity to learn what it is that I want to do. There's all these different disciplines that were never there when I was at school. I remember my bookkeeper, Jenny, actually saying, and she's roughly the same age as you, and she said, you know, when I was younger, I had two options, nurse and secretary, or a teacher, actually three. And she said, I had no options available to me. This is in the UK. I had no options available to me to do the criminal psychology that I wanted to do, to run the business of the future that I wanted to lead, to explore the research that had yet to be explored. She never had the chance. And I think many of us have got so many opportunities, we're almost overwhelmed by all the choices. And now's the opportunity to ask that question, not only what do I want to unlearn, but what do I definitely not want to do? So PhD researchers have to do this all the time because everything's interesting. You want to read everything. So you have to figure out, right, that's not research. Nope, nope, nope. And only this is. It's kind of similar. It's like hacking away at the future of the time that you would like to spend doing what, and then measuring how you can make that viable.
All on one side. Over here.
Thank you, Dr Kansara. Sam Power is my name.
Hello.
Early in your address, you gave the example of a city being built in Abu Dhabi, and I think you were saying that you felt that the designers hadn't accounted for the net energy invested up to the point where they pushed the go button to start the city running. It seems to me in South Australia, the core challenge we face and that we've come hard up against in recent times has been the concept of net energy, which is basically, as I understand it, the energy that is required to keep the whole apparatus running before you actually go out and do innovation, entrepreneurship and so on. I'd be really interested if you could very briefly expand on where you think the concept of net energy fits in your Replenish Index model. Thank you.
I think I'm going to refer back to the Replenish Business Canvas, which is in a similar method of using that as a basis of business. You're also using that as the basis of master planning cities. If you were to, imagine if you went to a conference in, say, Ecuador, but in order for the conference not to bring in, say, 200-300 people, to actually create the food that was necessary for that event itself on site leading up to the actual conference. So what kind of measures or renewable measures or other practices can actually really introduce this level of preparation, like the embodied cost or the embodied carbon, and sequestering that right at the start of designing buildings and cities and anything else that we design in the future. So part of it is what kind of methods can actually be used today and what kind of measurements there are still gaps for. And there are many, many gaps. And I think by opening up this debate, we get to learn what different tactics people are using across the world for exactly the same issues.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have to end the discussion here.
No.
Can I say on behalf of all of us here what an interesting address this has been, and we are very appreciative, as a token of our appreciation, are some splendid gifts.
Wow, thank you.
Have you think of us fondly into the future.
I think they're
So ladies and gentlemen, would you join me in thanking Tia very much indeed for the address. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, that does bring us virtually to the end of proceedings, but not quite. I just wanted to mention that if you're interested, the discussion continues tomorrow at an open state event that I'll be addressing along with other colleagues tomorrow, 2 to 5 p.m. in the Open State Hub just across the way here. The title is South Australia Becoming the Entrepreneurial State, ? We'd love to see you. On behalf of Flinders University, I thank you all for your enthusiastic participation in this 2017 Flinders University Investigator Lecture. Good evening.